For the abstraction, the history of philosophy is replete with men and women who inquired into the fundamental nature of the self, along with the question of the primary substratum that defines the multiplicity of things in the world. The inquiry on the self has preoccupied the earliest thinkers in the history of philosophy, the Greeks. It was the Greeks who seriously questioned myths and moved away from them in attempting to understand reality and respond to the perennial questions of curiosity, including the question of self. The different perspectives and views on the self can be best seen and understood then by revisiting its prime movers and identify the most important conjectures made by philosophers from the ancient times to the contemporary period. Socrates and Plato. So Socrates and Plato are considered to be the founding fathers, particularly in the philosophy of understanding the self. However, it must also be noted that prior to Socrates, the Greek thinkers, sometimes collectively called the pre-Socratic, to denote that some of them preceded Socrates, while others existed around Socrates' time as well, preoccupied themselves with the question of primary substratum, archie, that explains the multiplicity of things in the world. These men like Thales, Pythagoras, Parmenides, Heraclitus, and Empedocles, to name a few, were concerned with explaining what the world is really made up of and why the world is so, and what explains the changes that they observe around them. Tired of simply conceding to the mythological accounts propounded by the poet theologians like Homer and Hesiod, these men endeavored to finally locate an explanation about the nature of change, the seeming permanence despite change, and the unity of the world amidst diversity. So before trying to move further, so it must be duly noted here that before Socrates and Plato, there are also other Greek thinkers who are starting now to question some particular subjects that are perplexing them, something that concerns them, that they don't want really to submit themselves with the so-called mythological accounts by poets like that, Homer and Hesiod, and some others, and they wanted now something of a logical reason that explains the nature of things in as they considered here as the primary substratum archie, which explains the multiplicity of things, that they wanted to make sure that a thing may mean something or may have a multiple meaning or implication or perspectives. So after a series of thinkers from across the ancient world who were disturbed by the same issue, a man came out to question something else. A man came out to question something else, and this man is Socrates. Unlike pre-Socratics, Socrates was more concerned with another subject, the problem of the self. He is the first philosopher who ever engaged in a systematic question about self. To Socrates, and this has become his lifelong mission, the true task of a philosopher here is to know oneself. Socrates affirms, claimed by Plato in his dialogues, that the unexamined life is not worth living. Here, this is a very impactful statement coming from Socrates that he actually believed that the unexamined life is not worth living. Now, on your part, would you really try to subscribe to this idea that if we will not try to examine our life, then our living will not be worth it? That seemingly our life here on earth is useless because first and foremost, we did not try to understand or examine ourselves. During his trial of allegedly corrupting the minds of the youth and for impiety, Socrates declared without regret that his being indicted was brought about by his going around Athens, engaging men, young and old, to question their presuppositions about themselves and about the world, particularly about who they are. Socrates looketh upon himself to serve as a gadfly that disturbs Athenian men from their slumber and shakes them off in order to reach the truth and wisdom. Most men, in his reckoning, were not fully aware of who they were and virtues that they were supposed to attain in order to preserve their souls for the afterlife. Socrates thought that this is the worst that can happen to anyone, to live, but die inside. So another statement which is similarly impactful to the first one, which is the unexamined life is not worth living, and to live, but die inside. So this is a very impactful statements coming from Socrates. And as you might know that Socrates is also the famous person who popularized the so-called Socratic method, wherein Socrates is very much fond of the so-called the question and answer portion, where he will try to pose a certain question, which is a very much enlightening one and a challenging one, which tries to probe now each particular man, young and old, as what's been stated here, to actually answer that particular question, and out from that is be able to generate ideas from them, or he wanted now to draw out the ideas that he wanted to come from them, because as a philosopher is a very intelligent one, and he wanted now to recreate or shall we say to establish a connection, to establish now the true idea that he wanted a particular person to conceive out from himself. So that is the Socratic method. For Socrates, every man is composed of body and soul. This means that every human person is dualistic, that is, he is composed of two important aspects of his personhood. For Socrates, this means all individuals have an imperfect, impermanent aspect, the body, while maintaining that there is also a soul that is perfect and permanent. So here, even Socrates himself, as or in relation to our common religion and belief now, that he also believed in what we call the dualistic uh, nature of human person, which is every man is composed of a body and a soul. So if we try to consider this, it's also true, right? Because every man, according to him, is composed of body and soul. And based on our Christian beliefs or even in Islam beliefs, so this particular idea is very correct or applicable. Moving on to Plato. Plato is actually Socrates' student who basically took off from his master and supported the idea that man is a dual nature of body and soul. But in addition to what Socrates earlier espoused, Plato added that there are parts of three components to soul: the rational soul, the spirited soul, and the appetitive soul. In his magnum opus, The Republic, Plato emphasizes that justice in a human person can only be attained if the three parts of the soul are working harmoniously with one another. The rational soul, forged by reason and intellect, has to govern the affairs of the human person, while the spirited part, which is in charge of emotions, should be kept at bay, and the appetitive soul, in charge of base desires like eating, drinking, sleeping, and having sexual intercourse, is controlled as well. When this ideal state is attained, the human person's soul becomes just and virtuous. So as you can see now, there are actually very much similarities between Socrates and Plato's belief, owing of course to the fact that Plato is a student of Socrates, and much of course of the ideas that Plato is now subscribing into is very much attributable to what Socrates believed into, and he was able to convince Plato of the same um, beliefs. However, since Plato now has also tried to expand the idea of soul having made up of three parts, as been earlier stated, and he said or he claimed that when these three particular parts of soul is working harmoniously, or three component soul is working harmoniously, then one will become just and virtuous.